Amen. So happy Sabbath, everybody. This morning is a review, partly a review of a series of presentations Elder Tess did in June 2020. I have already started this and we've done one or two presentations on this. So we'll do a brief review, and those presentations from June 2020 were State Nationalism and Do We Have the Freedom, Part 1 and 2. And what I want to do also is tied into our Vespers studies. So I, like all of you, are trying to do my best to understand the point of Vespers and what it's about. And so I'm going to begin this morning by trying to do that. And I'm going to start with a question. And so let's look at over here. In this history here, so in 2018, 19, 20, around that time, why can't we do public evangelism? Or why can't we harvest these Levites? So here we are, we're going through here, we're in here. Why aren't we allowed to go to these people yet? What's the problem? We weren't ready. So we're in, if we look here, where's Adventism? They're here. And where are we? We're here too. So how can we harvest or help that group when we're in the same mess and we think the same way? Could you imagine in that history going and the subject of, let's just pick one topic, LGBTQI plus marriage equality? How would that discussion have gone? So we would have been, we're in the same mess. And so that's why here we had to make a change. And what had to happen, we actually had to sift ourselves in order to help that group. We had to actually move. And we know that because that's what Vespers has taught us. But we're going to try and marry these two together. So in order for us to, remember yourselves. Do you remember when you actually moved to here and you looked back over here, were you horrified? You're going, oh, I can't believe the things that I used to believe. Or so only when you actually made that move were you able to see the problems. When you're in here, you can't see the problems. Now that you can see the problems, you can actually help that group to see the problems. So, and let's just pick a figure. Let's just say 98% of the movement were right wing. It was probably more. So many moved, many didn't move as well. There's quite a few that didn't move. And so here we are. Now we're over here. So now we're in a position to help the Levites. So here we are. Now we're walking through here. Now can we help the Nethinims? Because now we're in this history. Can we help them? I'm happy for interaction. Why can't we help them?
Not ready.
Why aren't we ready? This is just a visual representation. I'm not saying this is exactly where they are located, but it's just to show you the point.
We still have more to learn.
So let's just say this is radical feminism. Right here. What did we do? We moved over to the left, and to the left had problems.
Yes.
So where are the where are the Nethinims? Because they have an interest in equality over freedom. They're already in that mindset. But we're here, but we're in the same mess as the left. So we had to move from here to here to see the problems here. Now that we're here, where do we have to move to see the problems here? Because 98%, and Elder Tess has all warned us that not at least 98% of this movement are not radical feminists. So we're here. Now what do we have to do to see the problems of the left? To see...
Move to radical feminism.
Now we're here and we all have to move to there. We should have moved from there straight to here, because what was the increase of knowledge of the Sunday law?
Feminism. Radical feminism.
I heard a few different answers. What was 2019? What was the increase of knowledge?
Feminism.
Someone said the right answer. It was feminism. And that makes perfect sense, because in that history, we're over here. You have to be a feminist. Where are the feminists? Are they over here?
No.
No, you have to move. But we didn't listen properly, because we moved over here and we became
radical.
Well, no, we didn't. We became racial, cultural, social justice warriors, as Elder Tess would say. And so it made perfect sense we had to move here, but we should have moved here. But because we weren't listening well enough, the formalisation came along. And what did the formalisation say? It's not just feminism, it's radical feminism. So it's not just feminism on the left. You've got to be radical feminists. And if you're not a radical feminist, can you see the problems of the left?
No.
If you're over here, you can't see the mess because you're in the mess. Now we're in the mess here. And the question was asked a while ago in Vespers, how do you sift the left? The only way you can sift the left
Radical.
is you become this. You will never see the problems with the left until you move here. So what's one of the main problems of the left? Because we're all in this, we're in the mess. Just before I go there, I just hope most of us, I hope all of us actually make this move, because a lot didn't make this move. And I hope a lot make this move from here into here, wherever that is. I'm not sure exactly where that is, but let's just say it's there for the moment. I forgot what question I asked.
You asked what's wrong with, I think you asked what's wrong with the left or something.
Yes. So what's one of the main problems? It's in actually the name: racial, cultural, social justice warriors. So what's the definition of a radical feminist? They see that the root of global problems is sexism, because it's the oldest, it's the worst, it's the deepest source of discrimination that has ever existed. So what does the left think? So if the left are in a train, they're in the train, they get to their destination station and they get off. And what's that station called? It's called racism. So their destination point is race. And that's why when you listen to the when you listen to Vespers, you will hear I've just lost my point. But anyway, let's get back to the train. So the destination point is race, and that's the station. But radical feminists don't get off that station. They go, yes, we agree with that station, but we're going to go to the next station. And what's the next station? It's sexism, because they know that's the root of that's the problem. So when you've got this main group stopping at race and this group continuing on saying, well, hang on, gender, Elder Tess is trying to help us understand that they actually come in tension. They actually conflict at some point. Well, I should give you an example. So I guess the conflict that Elder Tess, I think, and I'm happy to be corrected by Elder Terry, that the conflict that I think Elder Tess is trying to help us understand is the approach to equality. The priority of the equality, or the priority of the focus, the destination point is different in the two groups. And it seems all similar, but when I'm hoping Elder Tess gives us lots of more examples where that actually doesn't work out so good. And an example of that would be, so let's say you've got the left having a racial, cultural, social issue that they're dealing with, which is all good. It's fine, and it's good because they're prioritizing equality over freedom. So they're trying to fix a problem. But if your focus is on race, then you see, say, a white woman come along and say, well, that's fine, but how are you treating women in that culture, in that indigenous culture, in that? So you can start seeing how problematic that can become, because what's the biggest problem of what does the left see as the biggest problem? It's not Merkel, it's what's the word, when colonialism. And what's colonialism? You've got generally a white culture coming in, interfering into another culture and intervening. And that's why, say, the far left, like Blumenthal, will say he will support Russia and not let America intervene because that's colonialism, or support Venezuela or something like that. So their fear is colonialism. And if you've got all of a sudden someone coming in and intervening, say a white woman intervening into a culture, that's colonialism. And they're saying, well, hang on, you're abusing women, your culture abuses women, and that's not okay. And it only becomes a problem if your destination point is race and then it stops. Can everyone see? That's just one small example of how this becomes problematic with this. Is everyone okay with that? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Thank you, Brennan.
Okay. So today, we want to be radical feminists. So what's our destination point? Is it race or is it gender?
Gender.
So every presentation we're watching, what's behind me? That's all about race. It's all race. But what am I really talking about? Because I'm trying to be a radical feminist. So what is this really talking about? This is just a means to an end. This is the means to get us to gender. This is not the end itself. This is not the destination point. So when we go through, when everyone's watching these presentations and people are going to, you know, going back into the Millerite history, or, you know, that's a means to an end, and the end itself is not race, it is gender. And that is why, that's one of the main problems here. So as we're going to go back in now, we're going to go back into the history of slavery, which is race. But we know in your back of your mind, you should be going, that's gender. That's gender. Everything I say, you should be going, oh, that's gender.
Excuse me, Brenden.
Yes.
Is it right to say that what we're doing is we're comparing and contrasting racism with sexism, so we can see the correlations and things like that? Is that what you're meaning?
That's exactly right. And I'm going to say that in a negative way. I'm going to say, yes, that's exactly why, because it's the triple application of prophecy. We know it's this history plus the 1888 history equals the Sunday law history. But if you're a radical feminist, say if you're not a radical feminist, when you think about looking back into this history, why do we do that? And it's to get our bearings. We go back into here, and I'm going to say it in a negative way. It's almost like sometimes we have to go back into the history of race to then go back into the history of our history of gender. So only when do we go back here and apply the same principle, we see how horrific it is. Does that make sense? So we're going back here and we're we look back here, only when we go back to race and slavery, we go, oh, that's how bad it is, because we didn't see how bad it was in gender. But if we're a radical feminist, we would say, well, hang on, it's actually gender is worse. Why then do we have to go back into the history of race to see how bad it is?
It becomes a parable.
Yes. And that's exactly what it is. It's a parable.
Plus, we all understand, sorry, we've all developed sensitivity to racism. We all have that ability to relate to how bad that is. And if we can tap into that, then we are able, like you said, to see just how bad sexism really is. And Marilyn made some good comments in the chat too. The fact that you can have a look if you can see it. The fact that everything comes back to gender, even racism, really, because that was kind of what led up to that.
And it's just the growth of the information as well.
Yeah.
And we needed to go back into race to see how bad gender is. And we should see how bad gender is, the discrimination of women and gender is now as well.
We've learned to hate racism.
We now
learn to hate gender inequality as much more.
Yes.
We hate racism.
John just made a comment that I guess what I'm trying to say is we learned, or culture has learned to hate race or racism. And we need to know or to develop that and more hatred of sexism. And this is, I guess, what the message is helping us to do. Yes, and Catherine has made a mention. It's also the beginning of the Antichrist line of modern Babylon, with the history of the Holocaust, which parallels this history. So that should give us a snapshot as a parable as to how bad sexism really is. Because God says that. That's not me or Elder Tess, or that's what God has laid out in the lines. So we're focusing on racism today, but we're really talking about gender inequality as well in the back of your mind. Okay. And going back, I don't want to spend much time on this. It's just a brief review. And it was all about what is the sin of the USA. And we go all the way back to 1619, and when they were still colonies, they had first representative government, and they introduced the Sunday law, and they had slavery within a couple of weeks of that. So right at the beginning conception of the history of that country, they had two problems. And then then they got to the revolution. And when you think of a revolution, say you think of a revolution of a wheel or a tire or even anything, it's like a revolution basically does that. You start here, you do a revolution, and you end up where you started. So more often than not, in a revolution, like the French Revolution, you end up with a despotic Bourbon or Louis, and you end up with Bonaparte. So it's almost like they've done full circle, come back to where they started. So you end up with an authoritarian, you end up with an authoritarian. So we go to the American Revolution. You know, it was ruled by rich white men. The revolution happened and they were still ruled by rich white men. But see, that's a comparison, but our rules, we need to contrast. And so the difference between before and after, the difference, even with the French Revolution, we're focusing on the American Revolution, there was a remarkable difference. And that had been growing for quite some time. But at that point, I mean, we talked about, they put a wall of separation between church and state, and men are equal. But what did that actually look like on the ground? So what they said, it's what they meant by men are equal. They had a very different understanding of what we would think. So when they said men are equal, it referred to landowners, white, male. So it was about 14% of the population. So when they were saying that men are equal, that's what they meant. And so, but what it also meant, they had this idea, and this is what was the remarkably distinct that happened. They said, you know what, it doesn't matter whether you're born into the aristocracy or whether you're born as a king or part of that family or this. You know what? I have value. Well, the 14% said that anyway. I have value. So I you know what, I'm equal. Actually, just because I'm not born into that family doesn't mean I cannot do things. I'm free. I have equal opportunity. I can go and do stuff. They weren't really referring to women, and they weren't referring to African-American slaves, obviously. But that's the seed that began. So remember this, and Takasa showed us part of the Eden to Eden model. This is the moment where God started restoring human beings. And so right at this moment, you've got this seed, this understanding that, you know what, just because I'm not born into royalty, or, you know what, I don't care. I have the same value. I am equal to that person. It doesn't matter. And that's the seed, even though they didn't practice it to the extent that we understand it today, or even back then. And so when you think about that seed, that's like a message that when we talk about our message in 1989, what was the message? Or 1996, the Sunday law's imminent because there's a battle between the King of the North and King of the South in 1989. Sunday law's imminent. It continue on to 2001. By the time you get to 2016, you know there's two more battles, Raphia Panium, the Midnight Cry happens, Acts 27, you've got, oh, hang on now, there's an extra two battles. It just grew and grew. That seed that seed turned into an enormous amount of information, and you can see the development of the message and the implication of 1996. It's like, imagine if you just stopped at 1996 and said, you know what, that's all, I'm gonna stop there, I'm good. Think about all the growth. So what I'm saying is, as this seed occurred, it meant all equal. That's going to develop and get bigger and bigger and bigger until here we are today, and the arguments are about gender equality and LGBTQ rights. But that's not what they meant back there. And you've got two sides here in a culture war, and they're arguing over, these are wanting to, they're the ones saying, hang on, it doesn't say that. We're the originalists, and we're going to go back and say, you know what, it is actually about land owning white males. This group saying that because the message is developing, it's expanding. And they're saying, oh, that's really inconsistent. I can't myself knowing that, hang on, you're saying you were oppressed by England back there because they would, you know, you didn't have representation in the, you know, the English courts. So you were saying you had no freedom because England were taxing you, and you didn't have representation to decide whether you were going to be taxed or not. And then simultaneously, you're stealing the freedom of others. And so this group followed the progression of that message of that seed as it grew. This group were originalists and wanted to keep the original understanding of that. And so as we came through here, this is just a battle of ideas. No, we want to go back to how it was. They're saying, no, equality actually means African men. So this is an argument that's continued all the way till now. This is a battle between what that seed actually means. So as we go through here, development of this understanding with anti-slavery society. So the abolitionist movement, they're developing. And then when we get to 1844, there's a separation in the churches, because the argument, the problem is to intervene or not to intervene. That is the question. So intervention. So why was there a separation here? Because the North looked at the South and said, these are in the churches. So the Baptist churches. So you've got ministers here talking to ministers there saying, tell those sinners down there to stop owning slaves. What did they saw that as an intervention. Stop intervening into our life. We can practice our lives. Stop intervening into our culture. We have the right to practice our freedom the way we want to do it. We have the right to practice our religion the way we want to practice it. And so this was an argument over, they were angry because they saw the North intervening into them, the northern churches, and it was over, they wanted to nominate a slaveholder into a responsible position of the church, and they said, no, we're not letting you have a slaveholder take a prominent position in the church. We just don't agree with that. And so they're saying you're taking our freedom to choose these administrators. And again, it was all about to intervene or not to intervene. They were intervening. They said, stop intervening. We go through, we won't talk about annexing Texas, but you can see this argument. The South had this argument, and it was always, we're fighting for our freedom to practice what we want to in our state. Stop intervening. And they had the religious liberty argument as well. And so this just brings us back to what we were talking about this morning. It's this tussle over freedom over equality, equality over freedom. So you can see the two sides play out in the history of race, in the history of racism. Same argument, equality over freedom. And so these people were following the growth of that initial seed that all men are equal. That now actually means African Americans, I'm sorry. And so they're prioritizing that principle of equality over freedom. This group was saying, no, we have the freedom and religious liberty to over the equality of African slaves. All right. So the great question in the churches was, are we allowed to intervene? South says no, North says yes. Now, I won't talk about that because annexation of Texas, I'll briefly mention it. John C. Calhoun did a really terrible speech to Congress in which to basically justify his racism by, they didn't want to include Mexico into the Union because that would mean that then they would have to include mixed race people into the Union, and therefore they would become equal citizens. And he said, no, we're not doing that. So, and the justification, which I won't go into, he used was freedom and religious liberty to justify his racism. Get to 1850. This is where it gets a bit complicated. So what's the great question? To intervene or not to intervene? So the Fugitive Slave Act passed. It was federal law, it was in the Constitution. And so now you've got the northern states. What was their argument? Because the northern states said, we're not following that. And what was their argument? What did they use? They used the argument of states' rights. So the South was wanting to get their slaves back, and the North was saying, you know, a lot of the North was saying, we don't care, we're not sending them back. We're in our state, we can do what we want in our own state, we're not following that unjust law. That's what their argument was. So it was states' rights. Again, the South was wanting to intervene into the North. The North said, no, you're not intervening. This caused a massive problem. So this was one of the major grievances that led to where we're heading now, which is the Civil War. Now, because now we get to the Civil War, what is the great argument going to be? To intervene or not to intervene? So now who's intervening where? What is the South saying? They're wanting to get out of the Union. They're succeeding from the Union because they fear the party of Lincoln is the government of abolition. And what is the government of abolition going to do to the South? What's their ultimate fear that's going to destroy their institutions in the South? They're scared that the North, or the Northern coalition of states headed by the federal government, is going to come down, intervene and abolish slavery. So they're saying we're out of the Union. We've had enough. We've been fighting this culture war for decades. And now it's got to this point where we know they're going to come in and destroy our institutions of slavery. So they're saying the North, you can't intervene. And now we're going to read some quotes of the arguments that the Southern states had just before I go on, here you've got, I'll read some quotes. So let's talk about just here, at the beginning of the Civil War, or just leading into, and we're going to start reading some quotes about why the South is so angry. So Lincoln, was elected president on November 6, 1860. Southern Carolina exploded with excitement, excited with the news. For too many of the people there, Lincoln's victory was the signal that ended the state's ties to the Union. To them, it was the beginning of Southern independence, the day that Lincoln won that election. Southern Carolina lowered their United States flags, and raised their state flag in its place. They were joyful. It was the beginning of Southern independence. It was the Southern states' attempt to succeed based on the 10th Amendment argument that Lincoln's actions were designed to prevent, and this led to the Civil War. So this is the beginning. So the beginning of the end, even though the Cultural War had been going on for a long time, and it was this battle between these two. The writing's on the wall, and it's heading to the climax of that history. So now we're going to see some of the Southern states' arguments as to why they want to succeed or get out of the Union. Every state in the Confederacy issued an article of succession declaring their break from the Union. 4 states went further than that: Texas, Mississippi, Georgia, and South Carolina. And that's where John C. Calhoun was. He was the one who was fighting for this side in this history. So Georgia said, let's start with Georgia. The people of Georgia have dissolved their political connection with the government of the United States of America, present to their Confederates and the world the causes which have led to the separation. For the last 10 years, we have had numerous and serious causes of complaint against our non-slave holding Confederate states. With reference to the subject of African slavery, our Northern Confederates, after a full and calm hearing of all the facts, after a fair warning of our purpose not to submit to the rule of the authors of all these wrongs and injuries, have by large majority committed the government of the United States into their hands. So he's basically saying that the election of Lincoln is a grievance to them, and that's bad for them. So they're saying the northern states have submitted and put the government in the hands of abolitionists. The people of Georgia, after an equally full and fair and deliberate hearing of the case, have declared with equal firmness that this government shall not rule over them. A brief history of the rise, progress, and policy of anti-slavery and the political organisation into whose hands the administration of the federal government has been committed will fully justify the pronounced verdict of the people of Georgia. The party of Lincoln, called the Republican Party under its present name and organisation, is of recent origin. It is admitted to be an anti-slavery party, while it attracts to itself by its creeds the scattered advocates of exploded political heresies of condemned theories in political economy, the advocates of commercial restrictions, of protections, of special privileges, of waste and corruption, of the administration of government. Anti-slavery is its mission and its purpose. By anti-slavery, it is made a power of the state. The question of slavery was the great difficulty in the way of the formation of the Constitution, all the way back there. With these principles on their banners, utterances on their lips, the majority of the people, the North, demand that we shall receive them as our rulers. So what's their problem? What's the South saying? They're saying, now we've got this big northern government led by a lot of the northern states. They've come together, and now they're, by large majority, has elected a president that's hostile to the southern way of life. And the southern way of life and their culture is slavery. So what they're concerned about is this large northern government's going to intervene and take the autonomy of those states away. big government coming in, taking the freedom of the states to practice their way of life the way they want to. So this is a states' rights argument. That's what they're making. So what's the big question? Already, we've only gone to the first one. This is Georgia. And they're saying, we don't want the North, this big government to come in and intervene. To intervene or not to intervene? This is the diabolical great argument. And that's the grievance. That was the grievance when the separation of the churches. They were intervening into there. So it's going to be, because everyone's Protestant, remember? Everyone is Protestant here. So naturally, a culture war that's going to be played out in the country is going to play out in the churches, and then it's going to play out in the whole country, in the states. The South is saying, we don't want to be a part of this union anymore because you're attacking us and you're taking our autonomy, you're taking our freedom. And that's why I put freedom and states' rights. Let's go to South Carolina. This is their argument. The people of the state of South Carolina in convention assemble on the 26th of April 1852 declared that the frequent violations of the Constitution of the US by the federal government and the encroachment upon the reserve rights of the states fully justified this state in the withdrawing from the federal union. What are they going back to? They're going all the way back here saying we wanted to leave here because you were breaking the Constitution. And were they? Yes, because the Constitution said, northern states, you need to send those escaped slaves back to us. And you didn't. So they wanted to leave all the way back in 1852. But in deference of the opinions and the wishes of the other, so they held themselves back. They're saying we refrained from leaving because we were considerate of the other slaveholding states. So we forbore at that time to exercise this right. Since that time, these encroachments have continued to encroach. Encroachment is another word for intervene. So these encroachments have increased from this history to this history. And further forbearance, so we're not going to handle this anymore, ceases to be a virtue. In the year 1765, the portion of the British Empire embracing Great Britain undertook to make laws for the government of that portion composed of the 13 American colonies. Now, what's their argument? They've just told us that, hang on, what's happening here, the intervention and the encroachments onto the freedom of these southern states looks the same as compared to the War of Independence or the Revolution, American Revolution, because back then you had this tyrannical English government intervening, taking the freedoms of the colonies. And they're saying that is the same as this northern government encroaching, intervening into the freedom and autonomy of the southern states. And what do you have to do to a tyrannical, in their mind, a tyrannical English-British government? You have to abolish that government and you have to leave that institution. So what are they doing? That's what they're doing. We're going to leave. We have to abolish that government because it's become hostile to our own autonomy and our interests in our own state. The struggle for the right of these colonies to govern themselves ensured self-government resulted in 1776 and the self-government. So what are they arguing for? We want to be self-governing in our own state with no intervening. that they are right and ought to be free and independent states. And as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may have right to do. So they're quoting the Declaration of Independence. So they're reading the Declaration of Independence to mean this. They further solemnly declare that when any form of government becomes destructive of the ends for which it was established, it is the right of the people to alter and abolish it and institute a new government, deeming the government of Great Britain to become destructive of these ends. They declared that the colonies are absolved of all allegiance to the British Crown and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is ought to be totally dissolved. So they're saying we dissolved that because they became destructive to the colony's ends and we declared independence. That's what we're going to do here. What they're doing is comparing. They're comparing this with that. But what's part of the methodology they actually missing? They're not contrasting. And in the contrast, you'll see that, can you actually do that comparison in the first place? Because if all you do is compare, it sounds like a reasonable position. In pursuance of this Declaration of Independence, each of the 13 states proceeded to exercise its independent, separate sovereignty, adopted for itself a constitution, and appointed officers for the administration of government in all of its departments, legislative, executive, and judicial, for purposes of defence. They united their arms and councils, and in 1778, they entered into a league known as the Articles of Confederation, whereby they agreed to entrust the administration of their external relations to a common agent known as the Congress of the United States, expressly declaring in the first article that each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence. So what are they saying? This is about sovereignty of each state, freedom and independence of intervention. And every power and jurisdiction of right, which is not by this confederation expressly delegated to the United States in Congress assembled. This is a lot of words. I'm going to try and summarize as we go so it doesn't get too, because it can roll into each other, but I'll try and summarize as we go. The War of the Revolution was carried on, and on 3rd of September 1783, the contest ended and a treaty was signed by Great Britain in which she acknowledged the independence of the colonies in the following terms. His Britannic Majesty, this article acknowledges the said United States, and then it names all the colonies, to be free, sovereign, independent states, that he treats them with as much as such, and for himself, his heirs and successors, relinquishes all claims to the government, proprietary and territorial rights that was established by the two great principles asserted by the colonies, namely the right of the states to govern itself and the right of a people to abolish a government when it becomes destructive of the ends of which it was instituted. So what they're saying is, just like the Crown relinquishes all rights, and then the two priorities are, well, now you're free, independent states and you have complete autonomy. But also, if a government rises up and becomes destructive to the interests of each individual state, they have the right to rise up and take that government down. In the present case, that fact is established with certainty. We assert that 14 of the states have deliberately used for past years to fulfill their constitutional obligations, and we refer to their own statutes for the proof. It says for 25 years, this agitation has been increasing until it is now secured to its aid. This is the culture war. This battle has been happening for 25 years. So it is now secured its aid. Power of the common government. A sectional party has found within that article establishing the executive department the presidency, Abraham Lincoln, the means of subverting the Constitution itself. A geographical line has been drawn across the Union, and all the states north of that line have united in the election of a man to the high office of President of the United States, whose opinions and purposes are hostile to slavery. Now they're getting to the point. So the North, all these northern states have come together. They've elected an abolitionist president. That's what their mind is, and we know Abraham Lincoln this history is more complicated than that, because his priority was to preserve the Union. And he did say that, you know, if he could preserve the Union and not free one slave, he would do it. So this is, again, another thing in Vespers that we learned is history is very complicated. We simplify it down to simple terms, but when you look into it, it's quite complicated. So from the Southern's point of view, but in this history, Lincoln is still good. He's still a good choice. The South see him as the ultimate enemy because he's going to intervene. He's basically saying they've elected this big government. All the northern states have got together. And that big government is hostile to slavery. The guarantees of the Constitution will no longer exist. The equal rights of the states will be lost. States' rights. The slaveholding states will no longer have the power of self-government, of self-protection, and the federal government will have become their enemy. That's the argument they had with the revolution. They don't have representation. So their argument is it violates their freedom and it violates their states' rights. And that's why I've got that up there. And you can see this theme just continues. It's the same argument. Now we're going to talk about Texas. This is a good one. It's not that long, so bear with me. Texas says a similar thing. This acquiring of sufficient power in the common government is a means of destroying the institutions of Texas and the sister slaveholding states. So Texas, it's an existential threat. So they're saying it's going to destroy the institutions of Texas. So the executive federal government now has enough power to take down Texas's institutions, slavery. In all the slaveholding states, in violations of that good faith and commonality which should exist between entirely distinct nations, the people have formed themselves into a great sectional party, saying a similar thing. But what's interesting here is they see themselves as being a separate state, but in their mind, it's a totally separate, independent country. So each state is its own thing. Don't intervene into our own country. They see it themselves as a country. So how much freedom should each state have? Unlimited freedom, because they're their own country, as though their own distinct nations within the United States. Okay, now we're going to finish on this one because we could spend half an hour on this, but we're not going to, but this is a cracker. The people have made themselves strong enough in numbers to control the affairs of the other states based upon, so now they're going to explain what this intervention looks like, because Texas is going to explain why the North is intervening into their affairs. Based upon an unnatural hostility to these southern states, so it's an unnatural hostility, this intervention, and then explains what it is. And their beneficent patriarchal system of African slavery, proclaiming the debasing doctrine of equality of all men, irrespective of race or color, a doctrine at war with nature, in opposition to the experience of mankind, and in violation to the plainest revelations of divine law. What's that saying? So Texas has just explained why the North is intervening. It's because they're intervening with the debasing doctrine of equality, irrespective of race or color. So Texas has just told us this intervention is the debasing doctrine of equality. So who's prioritizing equality over freedom? It's this South. So they're telling us, and that doctrine of equality is at war with nature. So it's not natural, because African slaves are animals. And Takasa took us through some of the language that helps us understand this a bit better. In opposition to the experience of mankind, because what's culture, this has been in our culture for generations, thousands of years, we've had slaves. That's the experience of mankind. And in violation of the plainest revelations of divine law, what's the divine law? The Bible. So what's their argument? Religious liberty. We're reading the Bible, and divine law tells us that God mandates slavery. So get out, we're our own country. We don't want your debasing doctrine of equality, because God tells us this is how it is, and this is how nature says it is. They're basically adopting Darwinism. And that's just how they think. So this is the intervention. So when you contrast, because remember, they've compared the intervention of the South, the North to the South, as the same intervention as Britain to the colonies. So there's the comparison, but what's the contrast? Why are they intervening? To introduce the debasing doctrine of equality of all men, irrespective of race and colour. Why was the British Crown intervening into the colonies? This deserves a whole presentation on its own. Understand, because we know, because Vesper's helped us understand it, it's extremely complicated history, and it is. But England was intervening into the colonies, and it's because of the way they functioned. And how do I explain that? Maybe explain it. Their government run under like a mercantilism. You've heard of mercantile banks as an example. Well, mercantilism, I can't remember how to say it properly, this is why I'm explaining now why they intervene into the colonies. So it's a way where the government controls the economy for the purpose of expanding trade and wealth, for the purpose of expanding global power and influence. And so what it means is the colonies were perfect for this, because they would produce the raw materials, which the slaves did, but it's cotton, sugar, tobacco, things like that. They would then ship it to England, where they would manufacture those raw materials into products, which then would be shipped back to the colonies, and they would sell them to the colonists. And that's all fine and good, but it requires the colonies to continue to expand, and that's how they were going to dominate the world, expand their influence, and because they were in conflict with France for a long time. So this was their way of, and what that meant is, what caused prior to the revolution was the 7 Years' War, even though it lasted for 9 years. The 7 Years' War, and Winston Churchill said that was the first global war. It's like World War One, even though it's not called World War One. What that was about was England, because of this mercantilism, wanted to expand into, because France controlled a lot of territories outside. So you've got the colonies here, and then you've got all that territories all the way across to the ocean. And so France and Spain controlled a lot of that. And so what does England have to do? They have to expand the colonies. So they started invading into the French territory. French said, no, we're not having a part of that. And then you end up in this conflict, this war. And so fast forward, England won. They started divvying, because it was a global event, because they had territories or colonies all over, France and England. They started divvying up the land so they could stop the war. England got the territories from the colonies across. So what ended up happening? So in war, you got massive debt. So what ended up happening? They said, well, we've done this land grab for the benefit of the colonies, even though it's not really, it's the benefit to expand the wealth, because then they started putting tariffs on and like monopolizing to keep that system running. So the colonies couldn't trade with others. They had to buy the materials so they basically trade locked it in some ways. So you can start seeing the colonies start getting a bit upset with that. So what ended up happening, the war finished, but England kept a lot of the troops there, and that became a problem. And why they were intervening is because now the government was now wanting to raise money to pay for this war. And that became a problem. Everyone thinks that, oh, the argument about the revolution was about taxes, and well, it wasn't really. It was more about the colonies didn't have representation in the English government to decide whether the taxation should be applied in the first place. So it was, you got to step beyond the taxes. And so then they introduced like stamp taxes and things like that. And then you got the Tea Party revolution, or so it was, on the surface, it was about taxes. So you've got, basically the argument was, so if you want to understand the intervention, you got to read the Declaration of Independence and all the reasons why they wanted to declare independence. So there's a lot of arguments, and it was to do with freedom. They didn't really have the choice. So England was coming in, controlling them. So they, it was okay for them to get out of that situation. But, when you contrast it, the intervention there, England wasn't intervening into the colonies to stop horrific human rights violations. The North was intervening into the South to stop human rights violations. They were intervening into the colonies to expand wealth and power. They were intervening into the South to stop human rights violations. So I'm hoping the contrast is big enough that you get, and this comes down to, when can you intervene and when can you not intervene? When is it okay? When is it necessary to intervene? And a good example is, even in recent time, you had Donald Trump. He had a trade war with China, and he intervened and placed sanctions. And it was based on trade because of, for whatever reason, I won't go into the detail, but it was wealth, it was trade, it was similar to that, similar but different. But then you had Biden came in and he sanctioned China. Why did he? So they're both sanctioning China. One did it for trade and trade war, financial, money-based things. The other intervened. Why did Biden intervene and place sanctions on China? It was human rights violations. That it was the human rights violations against the Uyghur population. It was the genocide of that group. And so here you've got an intervention into the same country. What I'm saying is motive is everything. The contrast is in the reason, the contrast. So I'm hoping I didn't want to go into detail here. So, but that revolution and why they intervene, you could spend 3 presentations on. But we'll stop there and we'll continue on. Okay. One little point before I go on to the next stage is we've got the states' rights issue. So if we bring it back to today, subject of gender, when we look at the conservative majority of the Supreme Court and when they decided on Dobbs versus Jackson's Women's Health Organization, and that was recently, that's what overturned Roe versus Wade. It also overturned Planned Parenthood versus Casey. So in other words, it got rid of the woman's right to abortion federally. And what was their argument? What did the conservative majority say? You know what? It's not for this big federal government to intervene here. We need to send it back to the states. What does that remind you of here? Don't intervene, big federal government, into, it's the states should have the freedom to decide. It's like the UN High Commissioner, he said, each country culture has no right to interpret human rights according to their culture. And so what they're saying is, so in other words, everyone should just have it. So that decision that was handed down, this Supreme Court conservative majority have just said, no, we need to send it back to the states because the states have the freedom to do with that what they choose. So you can start seeing it's a similar principle being played out in front of our eyes, same as back here. To intervene or not to intervene. The conservative majority is saying no intervention, states can decide for themselves. The states can decide what women's equality looks like for themselves. These states can decide what racial equality looks like. And what did they do? They went back to the original seed and said, that's what racial equality looks like, because African Americans aren't a part of that equation. And that's exactly what the dissenters said in that when they dissented against the majority, they said the problem with the conservative majority, they don't see that abortion or access to reproductive rights is for women. They don't see that being linked to women's equality. They just can't see it. Just like this group, they can't see that African slaves are linked to equality because it just doesn't compute, because they're not a part of this men are equal. They can't link it. They can't see that the link between women's reproductive rights has anything to do with women's equality. They just can't see it. Same as back here. Has everyone got anything they want to add before I go on to, or a question briefly? Well, we've got 16 minutes.
I have a question.
Sure.
Is the reason they can't see it partly anyway based on power and control and not on just their rights?
They can't see it. They told us how they can't see it because it's against law and nature. This is how it's always been. The Bible says it, and and this Declaration of Independence says that all white men who own land are free. So they're reading all these things, which that's why they're adopting their position, because they don't believe that African slaves are human. So it doesn't enter their mind.
Can I comment?
Yes.
It's almost as if that they can't see because they just don't want to see. They keep rejecting the warnings that they've been given. That there's no excuse for the fact that they can't see. They love their greed and all the benefits that they get, and they're not willing to share, and so they're guilty. But they are kind of blinding themselves because of their greed and selfishness.
Perfectly said, and perfectly said.
I thought that they politicized the whole matter instead of using common sense.
Sorry, can you please repeat that, Molly? I missed that.
I thought they politicized the whole matter instead of using common sense.
The problem is their common sense is it's against natural law for African slaves to be equal. It makes no sense to them. And I think it has something to do with, they've got this seed, they're just not prepared to continue with that message because the seed grows into a massive tree. So they're originalists. What are the majority conservative Supreme Courts? They're originalists. They want to go back where equality meant this. This group is going all the way back to equality meaning this. Equality means 14% of the population are equal and have equal rights. We're getting to the point now where our message is saying 100% of the population have equality.
Can I just make a quick comment there too? Oh, sorry, Molly, do you?
Sure.
You continue if you're not finished.
No, I'm right. I'm right, Lynn.
Okay, I was just going to say it reminds me of when I was looking at bias and the fact that when we have a strong bias, we look for things to support what we believe. And really, you know, greed may be underneath, like Catherine said. I think that's definitely all parts of the reasons why we want to hang on to a bias. There could be multiple underlying factors. But then once that bias is so strong, you know, they'll hold on to it regardless of any information, or, you know, they're blinded because of their bias and they're continually looking for things to reinforce that point of view. Hence why they're going back in history, hence why they're looking at things like Aristotle's views in a sense. I mean, they're not necessarily looking at them, but they're agreeing with them. They're looking at the Bible from a literal perspective. They're taking the literal aspects of that to support their view. They're not willing to look at anything else because that means it's just going to pull the rug out of who they are because their bias is so strong.
I think I agree. And I think Elder Tess said it probably best, where she said that culture is strong and this is their culture. And that's what Vespers is all about. It's about how deep set this system is in their culture. So they're going to bend Constitution, Declaration of Independence, Bible, they'll bend, twist anything to suit their culture. And that's the warning for us. That's why Elder Tess is. Yes, sorry.
Sorry, Brendan. Do you mind if I just say something as well?
Yeah.
It's along what I think what Catherine was also saying is that group threat. If if they're not in control, they're not the people at the power with at the top with the power, then they're subservient. And so race was the first one. They made sure they were on top and controlled the race. And now it's gender. They have to stay on top of gender. Otherwise, they're going to be, their fear is they're going to be overcome by this wave of what they would think is gender inequality in the terms of men being underneath or subservient to women.
Yeah, I really appreciate that comment. That really sets it right, doesn't it? Thank you, Graham. It's good to hear you.
Brenden, this takes us back to Lucifer's government and God's government.
Yes, yes, it does.
The beginning, and it'll be the end.
Well, thank you everyone for your comments. As usual, I haven't got to the main points. So what I might do, I might I wanted to bring ourselves to Vespers and talk about libertarianism, because the subject, we've talked about lots of different things, but it's all about whether we intervene or not to intervene. And when you think about libertarianism that we would, Elder Tess is helping us to understand, you know, it paints that I guess when it sells that beautiful, wonderful picture that if a society has problems with equality, if it does mistreat portions of the population or another country, say it's a patriarchal society in its culture, libertarianism would sell the idea that we should allow absolute freedom in that culture. From a foreign policy point of view, if that country has adopted a philosophy of libertarianism, it would look like they would look at this sexist, patriarchal, abusive country that practices these human rights violations, and they would say, you know what, we'll listen to you, we'll include you, we won't be accusatory, we won't reprimand you, we should allow you absolute freedom to continue, we'll keep trading with them, we'll be inclusive, we won't impose sanctions. What we should do is prioritize freedom and not intervene in any fashion and not enact discipline towards that country, but ensure that country has freedom to attend global summits and trade and industry and become partners. And as this freedom dialogue progresses, so this is a libertarianism model from a country's point of view. So as this freedom model develops, as it progresses through friendship and partnership and community and giving them absolute freedom, that abusive country will start to change their wrong views. They will grow and change, and we can all get along without punishing that country or sanctioning that country. So this is an appealing philosophy globally. It can be called a message of diplomacy or peace, or even love, because you're not being a sticky nose into another country's business. You are trying to encourage towards good or influence towards good. So you're not intervening into the affairs of another country. And the warning there is, we should remember the difference between what libertarianism sells versus the reality when libertarianism is practiced. And we all know the story of Jimmy Savile. And it is a really good example of what happens when people get absolute freedom. When Jimmy Savile got absolute freedom, what happened to the equality of others, particularly those who are the most vulnerable? When no one intervened into Jimmy Savile, what was he able to do? He was able to commit horrific human rights violations, and that's what follows. So if a country applies that same principle, what would you expect to see? And what was the example Elder Tess gave us in Vespers? Do you remember the
Germany and
country?
Russia.
Thank you, Catherine. It was Germany and Russia. And so Germany practiced the libertarian philosophy towards Russia. And Russia was abusive and committed human rights violations towards a neighboring country. So as Russia increasingly turned authoritarian, Germany maintained friendship, continued as trading partners, was not accusatory, even after the invasion of Ukraine in 2014. Germany maintained a friendly trading alliance with Russia at the expense of Ukraine by signing on to the construction of Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, which helped Russia and hurts Ukraine. This occurred after the annexation of Crimea. So Germany's philosophy says you can change an abusive country by dialogue and trade, bringing them into the global economy. And through that, you can bring about political and social change as you communicate and increase economic ties with authoritarian countries like China and Russia. So don't punish them, don't tell them off, don't intervene, don't sanction, you bring them closer. And what has happened as a result? They've invaded Ukraine again. And so what initially began as a peacetime opening to a former foe, Germany opened up trade and partnership with Russia. And that has turned into an instrument of aggression. Germany is funding Russia's war, and in the first 2 months of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Germany paid nearly 8.3 billion euros for Russian energy. And this is a quote from the Vespers. Money used by Moscow to prop up the ruble and buy the artillery shells firing back onto Ukraine. And in that time, EU countries are reported to give 39 billion euros for Russian energy. This is more than double the amount of the Europe gave to Ukraine to defend itself. So they're giving Russia double the amount of money they're giving to Ukraine. So they're basically funding Ukraine to bomb, funding Russia to bomb Ukraine. So now Ukraine is greatly suffering from this situation. It's just that act. When you think you're doing the right thing, you're inadvertently protecting the perpetrator and hurting the victim. So their actions of inclusive libertarianism philosophy has caused horrific human rights violations. So it's the same as Jimmy Savile. All right, it's 12:30. So I guess I'll just say something very briefly and then we'll close. Here you've got Russia, Ukraine, Germany. And we've just explained what that relationship would look like. But what this is really about is gender equality. And I haven't got time to go into and explain Putin's, how he thinks, but we know it's a Russian model. So we know it's patriarchal, we know it's men over women. And that's how Russia views Ukraine. He in his speech just before the invasion, he called Ukraine my beauty, and that references it's a really derogatory term in Russia, and it references a slave or servant girl. And so when Putin is saying my beauty to Ukraine, he's basically saying you're my servant. And what happens when a servant girl doesn't do what the master tells her to do. Initially, it's verbal abuse. Then it's psychological abuse. Then it's physical abuse till they get killed. And that's what we're seeing played out in the Russian-Ukraine conflict. Because that's the model of misogyny. That's the model of patriarchalism, because that's the woman in submission to the man. And so I guess the plan was, which I haven't got to, but the plan was to then relate that to an everyday situation that we find ourselves, because, you know, here we are.
Brenden, can I just say something?
Yes.
Does that mean that in that model of Russia, does that mean that this war will go until the woman will really gonna be destroyed?
I'm just telling you what Vladimir Putin thinks of Russia.
Yeah.
I'm not
Okay.
telling you, I'm not giving you a prediction of what actually will happen. He sees, in the very fact that he called Ukraine my beauty, and when you understand what my beauty means in Russian culture, that gives you a snapshot of his mind. And he's the king of the South. We know what his model is.
Yeah. Yeah, okay, thanks.
Whether he's able to carry that out to what extent, you know, that brings us to other lines in the Midnight Cry about what happens to Russia leading up to the Sunday Law, which we won't go into. But what I think we'll stop there because we're out of time. Has anyone got any comments or quick questions before we close?
Thank you, Brenden. It was very clear.
Okay. Let's pray. Dear God in heaven, we thank you for the information you've been giving us for some time now. Help us to continue following the growth of the message. Help us to look back and see how you've led us, see how you've expanded our understanding over time, and see the message of equality expand all the way from 1798 through to now. And that original seed had all the ingredients to expand into what this movement was raised up to understand and explain. Radical feminism and the equality of women and LGBTQ communities. We thank you for this understanding. Help us to learn more and take correction from our elders, and our desire is to actually move from this broad left perspective into radical feminism. We need to do that, and help us with that work, help us to self-analyze and to take correction where is needed and it's necessary for us. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to take part in the work. We thank you for hearing our prayer, and we're just grateful for being a part of the blessing of this movement and the information that it gives. We pray in Jesus' name, amen.